The morning sun was just starting to peek through the clouds as Agent David Carter finished his third cup of coffee. He had been sitting in his car for over 6 hours, watching a warehouse on the outskirts of town. This wasn't just any ordinary building. It was the center of a major drug operation that his team had been tracking for months. David stretched his arms and checked his watch. It was almost 9 a.m., and his shift was finally coming to an end. The warehouse had been quiet all night with only a few workers coming and going. Nothing suspicious, at least not yet. But David knew that patience was key in this line of work. Sometimes the biggest breaks came when you least expected them. As a federal agent with over 12 years of experience, David had worked on everything from financial crimes to human trafficking cases. He had earned his position through hard work and dedication, graduating top of his class from the academy, and consistently delivering results. His colleagues respected him, and his supervisors knew they could count on him for the tough assignments. David picked up his radio and called in his report. "Base, this is Agent Carter. Surveillance complete for the night shift. No unusual activity at the target location. Heading back to base now." "Copy that, Carter. Good work. Get some rest and we'll debrief this afternoon." David started his car, a sleek black Tesla Model S that he had saved up for years to buy. It wasn't the flashiest car in the world, but it was reliable, quiet, and perfect for surveillance work. Plus, he loved the technology and the fact that it was environmentally friendly. His friends often joked that he was the only federal agent they knew who cared more about his carbon footprint than his arrest record. As he pulled out of the industrial area, David felt the familiar satisfaction that came with a job well done. Even though nothing dramatic had happened during his surveillance shift, he knew that every hour of watching and waiting was important. Criminal organizations didn't operate on a schedule, and you never knew when the crucial moment would come. Drive back to his apartment would take him through Maple Heights, one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. David didn't live there. His government salary, while decent, didn't stretch quite that far. But he enjoyed driving through the tree-lined streets with their well-maintained lawns and beautiful houses. It was peaceful and gave him a chance to decompress after a long night of work. As he entered the neighborhood, David noticed how quiet everything was. It was still early morning, and most people were probably getting ready for work or taking their kids to school. A few joggers were out on the sidewalks, and he saw an elderly man walking his dog. It was the kind of scene that reminded him why he did his job, protecting communities like this one. David was driving carefully, staying well under the speed limit, and making complete stops at every sign. Years of law enforcement training had made him a cautious driver, and he never wanted to give anyone a reason to question his professionalism. He was listening to a news podcast when he first noticed the police car in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars were a common sight, especially in nice neighborhoods where the local department made sure to maintain a visible presence. But as he continued driving, making several turns through the winding streets, the police car stayed behind him. Block after block, turn after turn. It was still there. David's training kicked in, and he started paying closer attention. The police car wasn't trying to pass him or take a different route. It was following him, staying about 2 car lengths behind and matching his speed exactly. This wasn't a coincidence. Behind the wheel of the police cruiser, Officer Rick Thompson was having thoughts that he probably shouldn't have been having. Thompson had been with the local police department for 15 years, and in that time, he had developed some attitudes that his supervisors either didn't notice or chose to ignore. When he first spotted the Tesla driving through Maple Heights, Thompson's initial reaction was suspicion. In his mind, there were only a few reasons why someone would be driving such an expensive car through this particular neighborhood at this time of day. None of those reasons seemed legitimate to him. Thompson had made stops like this before. Sometimes he was right about his suspicions, and sometimes he wasn't. But in his experience, it was better to be safe than sorry. The residents of Maple Heights paid good tax money for police protection, and part of that protection meant keeping an eye on people who didn't seem to belong. As he followed the Tesla, Thompson ran the license plate through his computer system. The registration came back clean. No warrants, no violations, no red flags. But that didn't satisfy him. Clean records could be misleading, and expensive cars in nice neighborhoods always made him wonder where the money was really coming from. David noticed that the police car was getting closer. He could see the officer behind the wheel, and something about the man's posture and demeanor made him uncomfortable. David had worked with local police departments many times throughout his career, and he had learned to read body language. This officer looked like he was hunting for something. David made another turn, this time onto Oak Street, one of the main roads through the neighborhood. The police car followed. David slowed down slightly, thinking maybe the officer just wanted to pass him, but the cruiser slowed down too. There was no doubt about it now. He was being followed. As a federal agent, David knew his rights and responsibilities in this situation. He also knew that being pulled over while on duty could complicate things, especially if he was carrying his service weapon and federal credentials. The best approach would be to remain calm and professional, no matter what happened. Thompson finally made his decision. He flipped on his emergency lights and activated his siren for a brief burst. In his mind, he was justified in making this stop. The driver of the Tesla had been driving through the neighborhood for several minutes, making multiple turns, almost like he was casing the area. Thompson had seen this kind of behavior before, and it usually meant trouble. David saw the lights in his rearview mirror and felt his heart rate increase slightly. He had been pulled over before, but not while on duty, and not in circumstances like these. He carefully pulled over to the curb, making sure to stop in a well-lit area where there would be good visibility for both him and the officer. As he put the car in park and turned off the engine, David's mind was racing through protocols and procedures. He was armed, which meant he would need to inform the officer immediately. He had his federal credentials, but revealing them too early in the interaction could escalate things unnecessarily. His best bet was to remain calm, be respectful, and see how the situation developed. Thompson approached the Tesla with confident strides, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. In his 15 years as a police officer, he had made hundreds of traffic stops, and he thought he had seen everything. But as he got closer to the driver's side window, he felt that familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the unknown. David rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, making sure they were clearly visible. This was basic procedure for anyone being pulled over, but it was especially important for him given the circumstances. He made eye contact with the officer and waited to see what would happen next. Thompson looked at the driver and immediately formed an impression. The man behind the wheel was well-dressed, calm, and appeared to be in his 30s, but Thompson's suspicions weren't satisfied. If anything, the driver seemed too calm, too prepared. In Thompson's experience, innocent people were usually more nervous during traffic stops. "Good morning, officer," David said politely. "Is there a problem?" Thompson studied David's face for a moment before responding. "License and registration, please. You mind telling me what you're doing driving around this neighborhood?" David reached slowly for his wallet, making sure to announce his movements. "I'm reaching for my license now, officer. As for the neighborhood, I was just driving through on my way home from work." "Work, huh?" Thompson said, taking the license that David handed him. "What kind of work keeps you out this early in the morning?" David paused for a moment. This was where things could get complicated. "I work for the government, officer. Night shift." Thompson looked at the license and then back at David. The name matched the registration he had run earlier, and everything appeared to be in order. But something still didn't sit right with him. Government work could mean anything, and people who were up to no good often had cover stories ready. "Government work," Thompson repeated. "That's pretty vague. You mind being more specific?" David knew he was walking a fine line. He couldn't lie to a police officer, but he also couldn't reveal details about an ongoing federal investigation. "I work in law enforcement, officer. Federal level." Thompson's expression changed slightly. This wasn't the answer he had been expecting, and it complicated things. But he wasn't ready to back down just yet. People claimed to be all sorts of things during traffic stops, and expensive cars sometimes came with expensive lies. Federal law enforcement, Thompson said, his tone becoming more skeptical. In that case, I'm sure you won't mind stepping out of the vehicle so we can have a proper conversation. David felt the situation starting to escalate in a direction he hadn't wanted it to go, but he also knew that cooperation was his. Officer Thompson returned from his patrol car with a different energy than before. The computer check had come back clean, no warrants, no violations, not even a parking ticket. But instead of reassuring him, this information seemed to make him more suspicious. In his mind, people who were up to no good often had clean records because they were smart enough not to get caught. Interesting, Thompson said, as he approached David again. Your record comes back squeaky clean. No tickets, no violations, nothing. That's pretty unusual for someone your age. David wasn't sure how to respond to that. Was being a law-abiding citizen now somehow suspicious? Officer, I try to follow all traffic laws. I don't see how that's a problem. It's not a problem, Thompson said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I'm just curious about a few things, like how someone in government work can afford a car like this. He gestured toward the Tesla. These things cost, what, $60,000, $70,000? David felt his patience starting to wear thin. This line of questioning was completely inappropriate, but he knew that getting angry would only make things worse. Officer, with respect, my personal finances aren't really relevant to this traffic stop. Can you tell me what traffic violation I'm being cited for? Thompson didn't like the question. In his 15 years on the force, he had developed a routine for these kinds of stops, and people who asked too many questions usually had something to hide. I'm conducting an investigation here, and I'll ask whatever questions I think are necessary. Now you want to tell me again what you were doing driving around this neighborhood? As I mentioned before, I was driving home from work. I took this route because traffic is usually lighter through here in the morning. Home from work? Thompson repeated. At 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, that's an unusual schedule for most government jobs. David realized that no matter how he answered these questions, this officer was going to find something suspicious about his responses. It was becoming clear that Thompson had already made up his mind about this situation, and facts weren't going to change his opinion. Some government work requires unusual hours, officer. I'm sure you understand that not everyone works 9 to 5. Thompson walked slowly around the Tesla, examining it from different angles. Beautiful car, he said. Must be nice to afford something like this. Tell me, what kind of government work pays well enough for a ride like this? The question hung in the air between them, and David could hear the implication clearly. Thompson wasn't just asking about his job. He was suggesting that David couldn't legitimately afford the car he was driving. Officer, I saved for years to buy this car. I work hard, I live within my means, and I don't see how my personal financial decisions are relevant to this traffic stop. Everything's relevant when I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, Thompson said. You see, I've been patrolling this neighborhood for a long time. I know the people who live here. I know the cars they drive, and I know when something doesn't fit the pattern. David felt a chill run down his spine. The officer's words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear. Thompson didn't think David belonged in this neighborhood, and he was using his authority as a police officer to express that opinion. Officer, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was simply driving through a public road following all traffic laws. I don't understand why that would be considered suspicious. Thompson stopped walking and faced David directly. Here's what I find suspicious. It's 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, and you're driving an expensive car through one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. You claim to work for the government, but you can't give me any specifics about your job. You have a completely clean driving record, which is unusual. And now you're asking me a lot of questions instead of just cooperating with my investigation. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. Every single thing Thompson had listed, following traffic laws, having a clean record, being employed, were positive attributes that should have ended this stop 10 minutes ago. But somehow, in Thompson's mind, they had become evidence of wrongdoing. Officer, I don't understand how having a clean record and following the law makes me suspicious. Isn't that what we want from citizens? What we want, Thompson said, is honesty. And right now, I'm not getting the feeling that you're being completely honest with me. The accusation stung, especially because David had been nothing but truthful throughout the entire interaction. He had answered every question, provided his license and registration, and cooperated fully with everything Thompson had asked. But apparently, that wasn't enough. I have been completely honest with you, officer. I've answered all your questions and provided everything you've requested. Thompson pulled out his notepad and started writing. Let's go through this again. You say you work for the government. What agency? David hesitated. Revealing his federal credentials at this point would end the stop, but it might also escalate the situation in unpredictable ways. He had seen local officers react poorly to federal authority, and Thompson was already displaying signs of hostility. I work in law enforcement, David said carefully. That's what you said before. But law enforcement is a big field. Local police, state police, federal agencies, which one? Federal. Thompson looked up from his notepad. Federal law enforcement. That covers a lot of ground too. FBI, DEA, ATF, Secret Service. You want to be more specific? David realized he was trapped in an impossible situation. If he continued to be vague, Thompson would become more suspicious. But if he revealed too much about his work, he might compromise an ongoing investigation. I work for a federal agency that investigates financial crimes and organized crime. Thompson wrote something in his notepad and then looked at David with what could only be described as a smirk. Financial crimes and organized crime. That's interesting. Because in my experience, people involved in financial crimes and organized crime often drive expensive cars and have a hard time explaining where their money comes from. The implication was so outrageous that David almost laughed. Thompson was suggesting that because David investigated financial crimes, he might be involved in them himself. It was like accusing a firefighter of being an arsonist. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I investigate those crimes. I don't commit them. So you say. But like I mentioned before, I have a good sense for when people are telling me the truth and something about your story doesn't add up. David looked around and noticed that more neighbors had come out to watch the interaction. A woman walking her dog had stopped across the street and was openly staring. Two men who appeared to be on their way to work had paused on the sidewalk. David realized that this public spectacle was exactly what Thompson wanted, to make an example of him in front of the community. Officer, I'm going to ask you directly. What traffic violation am I being cited for? Thompson closed his notepad with a sharp snap. I haven't decided yet whether you're getting a citation. That depends on how cooperative you continue to be. I've been completely cooperative from the beginning of this stop. Have you? Because from my perspective, you've been evasive and vague about your employment. You can't adequately explain how you afford your vehicle, and you're asking me questions instead of answering mine. David took a deep breath. His training had taught him to de-escalate situations like this, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to remain calm in the face of Thompson's obvious bias and hostility. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I think we both know that this stop has gone beyond any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Thompson's expression darkened. Are you telling me how to do my job? Not at all. I'm simply pointing out that I haven't committed any traffic violations. I've answered all your questions truthfully, and I've cooperated fully with your requests. You know what I think? Thompson said, stepping closer to David. I think you're driving around this neighborhood looking for opportunities, maybe casing houses, maybe looking for cars to steal, maybe checking out security systems. I think your story about government work is just that, a story. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Thompson was now openly accusing him of planning to commit crimes based on nothing more than the fact that he had driven through a neighborhood while black. Officer, that's completely false. I was simply driving home from work. Prove it, Thompson said. Show me some identification that proves you work for the government. This was the moment David had been dreading. He could end this entire situation right now by showing his federal credentials, but doing so would reveal his true identity and potentially compromise his ongoing investigation. On the other hand, continuing to withhold that information was clearly making Thompson more aggressive. I have identification with me, David said carefully. But before I show it to you, I need to know that this stop is being conducted in good faith." Thompson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Good faith? You're the one who's been playing games with me for the past 20 minutes. I ask you simple questions, and you give me complicated answers. I ask you about your job, and you speak in riddles, and now you want to lecture me about good faith? I haven't been playing games, officer. I've been trying to balance my obligation to cooperate with law enforcement with my responsibility to protect sensitive information related to my work." Thompson took the leather wallet from David's hand, with obvious skepticism. He had seen all kinds of fake identification over the years, fake driver's licenses, fake insurance cards, even fake police badges. In his mind, someone who was trying to pull off an elaborate deception might very well have invested in convincing federal credentials. As Thompson opened the wallet, his eyes immediately fell on the gold badge inside. It was heavy, well made, and had all the details he would expect from real federal identification. But his suspicion didn't disappear. It actually grew stronger. In his experience, the more elaborate the fake ID, the more serious the criminal behind it. "Special Agent David Carter," Thompson read aloud from the identification card. "Drug Enforcement Administration." He looked up at David, who was still standing with his hands on the hood of his car. "Pretty impressive fake ID you've got here." David turned his head slightly to look at Thompson. "Officer, that identification is completely authentic. You can verify it by calling the DEA field office." Thompson laughed again, and this time there was even more hostility in his voice. "Oh, I'm sure you'd love for me to call some number you've memorized. Probably have one of your buddies standing by to answer the phone and pretend to be a federal supervisor." The accusation was so ridiculous that David almost couldn't believe he was hearing it. Thompson was suggesting that David had not only obtained fake federal credentials, but had also set up an entire phone scam operation to support his cover story. The level of criminal sophistication that would require was absurd. "Officer, you can look up the DEA field office number yourself. It's public information." "Sure it is," Thompson said, still examining the badge and identification card. "And I bet if I call that number, whoever answers is going to tell me exactly what you want them to tell me." David realized that Thompson had moved far beyond reasonable skepticism into pure paranoia. No amount of evidence was going to convince this officer that David was telling the truth, because Thompson had already decided that David was a criminal mastermind who had thought of everything. "Officer, that badge has a serial number on it. You can verify that serial number with DEA headquarters in Washington." Thompson looked more closely at the badge, and David could see him examining the serial number and other identifying marks. For a moment, David hoped that the obvious authenticity of the credentials would finally convince Thompson to end this ridiculous situation. "Pretty good work," Thompson said finally. "Whoever made this did their homework. But I've been doing this job long enough to know that criminals are getting more sophisticated every day." David felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had just provided Thompson with authentic federal law enforcement credentials, including a weapon that was clearly government issue, and the officer was still refusing to accept the obvious truth. "Officer Thompson," David said, reading the name tag on the officer's uniform, "I understand that you encounter people who lie to you during traffic stops, but I am not lying to you. I am a federal agent. Those credentials are authentic, and this entire stop is based on nothing more than your assumptions about me." Thompson's expression hardened at the mention of his name and the suggestion that his assumptions were inappropriate. "My assumptions? Let me tell you what my assumptions are. Based on 20 minutes ago, I saw an expensive car driving through a neighborhood where it didn't belong, being driven by someone who couldn't give me straight answers about his employment. I gave you straight answers from the beginning," David said. "I told you I worked for the government in law enforcement. I told you I was driving home from work. Everything I said was completely true. What you gave me was a bunch of vague non-answers designed to make me think you were something you're not." David turned around slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Officer, I want you to think about this logically. If I were a criminal trying to impersonate a federal agent, would I really do it during a routine traffic stop? Would I really carry a government-issued weapon and authentic federal credentials? Does any of this make sense from a criminal perspective? Thompson considered this for a moment, but his suspicion remained strong. What makes sense from a criminal perspective is that someone involved in serious criminal activity might have access to real federal credentials. Maybe stolen, maybe obtained through corruption, maybe part of some larger criminal organization. The suggestion that David might be involved in corrupting federal agents or stealing government property was so offensive that David had to take a deep breath to maintain his composure. Thompson wasn't just questioning his identity anymore. He was accusing him of serious federal crimes. "Officer, you're now suggesting that I'm involved in corrupting federal law enforcement officers or stealing government property. These are extremely serious accusations, and they're based on absolutely no evidence." "The evidence," Thompson said, "is that your story doesn't add up. You're driving an expensive car through a neighborhood where you don't belong, you can't give me clear answers about your employment, and now you're showing me identification that's either fake or stolen." David realized that Thompson had created an elaborate conspiracy theory in his mind, one that allowed him to dismiss any evidence that contradicted his initial assumptions. No matter what David said or showed him, Thompson would find a way to interpret it as proof of criminal activity. "Officer, I'm going to make this very simple for you. Call your supervisor. Explain the situation to him. Ask him to verify my credentials through official channels. This can all be resolved with a simple phone call." Thompson shook his head. "I don't need to call my supervisor. I'm perfectly capable of handling this situation myself." "But you're not handling it," David said, his frustration finally starting to show in his voice. "You're letting your personal assumptions override clear evidence. You have my authentic federal credentials, my government-issued weapon, and my complete cooperation. What more do you need?" Thompson stepped closer to David, and his voice took on a threatening tone. "What I need is for you to stop telling me how to do my job. I've been a police officer for 15 years, and I don't need some wannabe federal agent lecturing me about evidence and assumptions." David could see that the situation was reaching a dangerous tipping point. Thompson was feeling challenged and embarrassed, and his response was to become more aggressive rather than more reasonable. "Officer, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job. I'm trying to help you understand that you've made an error in judgment. It happens to everyone, and there's no shame in correcting it." "Error in judgment?" Thompson's voice rose in volume, and several neighbors who had been watching from a distance moved closer to hear what was happening. "The only error in judgment here is yours, thinking you could drive through this neighborhood without anyone noticing." The comment was so loaded with implications that David felt his professional training kick in. As a federal agent, he had been taught to recognize discriminatory behavior and to document it carefully for potential legal proceedings. "Officer, what exactly do you mean by that comment?" Thompson realized he had said something that could be interpreted as discriminatory, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his position. "What I mean is that criminals often think they're smarter than the police. They think they can blend in, act normal, and no one will notice. But experienced officers develop instincts for these things. And what instincts told you I was a criminal? The same instincts that have kept me safe for 15 years and helped me make hundreds of good arrests." David looked around at the growing crowd of neighbors and realized that this interaction had become a public spectacle. Whatever Thompson's original intentions had been, the situation had now escalated to the point where both men's reputations were on the line. "Officer, I'm going to ask you one more time to call your supervisor. This situation has gone far beyond what either of us intended, and it needs to be resolved by someone with more authority." Thompson looked at the crowd of neighbors and seemed to realize for the first time that his actions were being witnessed by members of the community he was supposed to serve. But instead of moderating his behavior, he seemed to feel pressure to justify his actions. "Fine," Thompson said finally. "I'll call my supervisor, but when he gets here and confirms what I already know, that you're running some kind of scam, don't expect any sympathy from me." Thompson walked back to his patrol car, still carrying David's weapon and credentials. David remained standing beside his Tesla, aware that dozens of eyes were watching his every move. He could hear people talking among themselves, speculating. about what was happening and why it was taking so long to resolve. A few minutes later, Thompson returned with a portable radio in his hand. I've called for backup and asked my supervisor to respond to the scene. He should be here in about 10 minutes. David nodded. Thank you, officer. I think that's the right decision. Don't thank me yet, Thompson said. When Sergeant Williams gets here and sees what you're trying to pull, this whole thing is going to get a lot more serious for you. David said nothing. Sergeant Williams handed David's credentials back to him with a professional nod, but David could see the concern in the older officer's eyes. Williams had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a situation had gone seriously wrong, and this was clearly one of those situations. Thompson, Williams said quietly, I need to speak with you privately. Thompson's face had gone pale when his supervisor immediately recognized David's credentials as authentic. The confident, aggressive officer who had spent the past 40 minutes harassing David had suddenly been replaced by someone who looked like he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. But Sergeant, Thompson began, I was just being thorough. You always tell us to trust our instincts. We'll discuss this back at the car, Williams said firmly. Then he turned to David. Agent Carter, I'm going to need a few minutes to sort this out with my officer. Would you mind waiting here? David nodded. Of course, Sergeant, but I do need to mention that I have obligations to my agency regarding this incident. Williams understood immediately what David was saying. Federal agents were required to report any interference with their official duties, and this traffic stop certainly qualified as interference. The situation had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding into the realm of official misconduct. I understand completely, Williams said. Please do whatever your protocols require. As Williams and Thompson walked back toward the patrol car for a private conversation, David retrieved his cell phone and called his supervisor at the DEA field office. Agent Carter, his supervisor's voice came through clearly. Weren't you supposed to be heading home after your surveillance shift? Yes, sir, but I've encountered a situation that I need to report. I was pulled over by local police while driving home, and the interaction has raised some serious concerns about potential discrimination and harassment. There was a pause on the other end of the line. David's supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Robert Hayes, had dealt with situations like this before, and he knew how delicate they could become. Are you safe right now? Hayes asked. Yes, sir. The officer's supervisor has arrived and recognized my credentials. The immediate situation is under control. Good. I want you to document everything that happened, and I mean everything. Times, names, badge numbers, witnesses, the whole works. We'll need a complete report for our files and potentially for the local department's internal affairs division. David looked around at the crowd of neighbors who were still watching the scene unfold. There are plenty of witnesses, sir. This all happened in public view. Even better. Get contact information from anyone who's willing to provide it. And Agent Carter? Yes, sir. You did nothing wrong here. From what you've told me, you handled this situation exactly as you should have. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The words were reassuring, but David knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Reporting misconduct by local law enforcement officers was a complicated process that could strain relationships between agencies, but it was also necessary to ensure that incidents like this didn't happen to other people. While David was on the phone with his supervisor, Sergeant Williams was having a very different conversation with Officer Thompson beside the patrol car. The crowd of neighbors couldn't hear what was being said, but they could see from Williams's body language that he was not happy with his subordinate. Thompson, do you have any idea what you've just done? Williams asked, his voice low but intense. I was conducting a legitimate traffic stop, Thompson replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried throughout his interaction with David. A legitimate traffic stop? Based on what violation? Thompson realized that he still hadn't identified a specific traffic violation that had justified the initial stop. He was driving suspiciously through the neighborhood, making multiple turns, going slow like he was casing the area. So he was following traffic laws? Well, yes, but nothing, Thompson. You pulled over a federal agent who was driving legally through a public neighborhood. And then you spent 40 minutes harassing him based on nothing more than your personal suspicions. Thompson tried to defend his actions. Sergeant, you always tell us to be proactive, to trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right. My instincts tell me to investigate suspicious behavior, not to harass law-abiding citizens. There's a difference, and you crossed the line today. Williams paused and looked over at David, who was still on the phone with his supervisor. Do you have any idea what kind of federal complaint this could generate? Do you understand that this incident could end up in the newspapers, on the evening news, maybe even in federal court? The reality of the situation was finally beginning to sink in for Thompson. What had started as a routine traffic stop based on his instincts had turned into a potential career-ending incident that could bring unwanted attention to the entire police department. What do I do now? Thompson asked quietly. Now you're going to apologize to Agent Carter, and you're going to hope that he's more professional than you were today. Then you're going to write a complete report of this incident, and you're going to be completely honest about what happened and why. Williams walked back toward David, who had finished his phone conversation and was making notes on his phone about the details of the stop. Agent Carter, I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. Officer Thompson's conduct was completely inappropriate, and I can assure you that it will be addressed through proper channels. David looked at Williams and could see that the sergeant was genuinely embarrassed by his officer's behavior. I appreciate that, Sergeant, but I hope you understand that I have to file an official report about this incident. Absolutely. You have every right to file a complaint, and frankly, you have an obligation to do so. This kind of behavior can't be tolerated. Williams gestured toward the crowd of neighbors who were still watching the interaction. As you can see, this incident had plenty of witnesses. Several of them have been taking pictures and videos on their phones. David hadn't realized that people had been recording the interaction, but he wasn't surprised. In the age of smartphones, most public encounters with law enforcement were documented in some way. That's probably for the best, David said. Documentation will make the investigation process more straightforward. Thompson approached hesitantly, looking like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Williams gave him a stern look and nodded toward David. Agent Carter, Thompson said quietly, I want to apologize for my conduct during this stop. I made some poor decisions, and I treated you inappropriately. David studied Thompson's face for a moment. The apology seemed genuine, but David knew that it was probably motivated more by fear of consequences than by actual remorse. Officer Thompson, I accept your apology, but I want you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't just inappropriate. It was discriminatory. You pulled me over because you made assumptions about me based on my appearance and the car I was driving. Thompson started to protest. That's not... Let me finish, David said firmly. You questioned my right to be in this neighborhood. You refused to believe that I could legitimately afford my car. You treated me like a criminal even though I hadn't committed any violations. And when I showed you authentic federal credentials, you accused me of being involved in an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Thompson looked down at his feet, unable to meet David's eyes. The reason I'm going to file a formal complaint isn't to hurt your career, David continued. It's to make sure that this doesn't happen to someone else who doesn't have federal credentials to protect them. Sergeant Williams nodded approvingly. Agent Carter is right, Thompson. Think about how this interaction would have gone if he had been an ordinary citizen without the authority to demand better treatment. The comment hung in the air for a moment as everyone considered the implications. How many other people had Thompson pulled over based on similar assumptions? How many had been too intimidated to challenge his behavior or too powerless to demand accountability? David retrieved a business card from his wallet and handed it to Williams. Sergeant, here's my contact information. I'll have a complete written report to you within 48 hours. Thank you, Williams said. And I'll make sure you get a copy of our internal investigation report when it's completed. As David prepared to leave, several neighbors approached him. They had been watching the entire interaction, and many of them seemed shocked by what they had witnessed. Excuse me, said a woman who appeared to be in her 50s. I live right over there, and I saw this whole thing from my kitchen window. I just wanted you to know that what that officer did was completely wrong. Thank you, David replied. Would you be willing to provide a witness statement if needed? Absolutely. I got it all on video too. I started recording when I saw him. Make you get out of your car. Other neighbors began to step forward, offering similar support and expressing their disapproval of Thompson's conduct. David was surprised by their willingness to get involved, but he realized that witnessing obvious injustice had motivated them to take action. A man who appeared to be in his 60s introduced himself as a retired teacher. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened here today. That officer was completely. 3 weeks after the incident, David was sitting in a conference room at the DEA field office, reviewing case files when his supervisor knocked on the door. Agent Carter, do you have a minute? I just got off the phone with Chief Martinez from the local police department. David looked up from his paperwork. Since filing his official complaint, he had been wondering what kind of response it would generate. What did the chief have to say? Assistant Special Agent in Charge Hayes took a seat across from David. Well, it turns out your incident wasn't an isolated case. After launching their internal investigation into Officer Thompson's conduct, they discovered a pattern of similar stops over the past several years. This news didn't surprise David, but it still felt significant to have it confirmed officially. How many similar cases did they find? 17 documented incidents over the past 3 years where Thompson pulled over drivers in affluent neighborhoods without clear traffic violations. The complaints were filed, but they never received serious investigation until your case brought federal attention to the pattern. Hayes pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. The good news is that the department is taking this seriously. Now, Thompson has been suspended without pay pending the completion of the investigation, and they're reviewing all of his stops from the past 5 years. David nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He was glad that accountability was finally happening, but he couldn't help thinking about all the people who had been treated inappropriately without getting any justice. What about the other victims? Are they being contacted? Yes, the department's Internal Affairs Division is reaching out to everyone who filed complaints about Thompson's conduct. They're reopening those cases and conducting proper investigations. Hayes paused and looked at David seriously. There's something else. The police chief wants to meet with you personally. He's proposing some changes to their training programs, and he'd like your input as someone with federal law enforcement experience. David was intrigued by this development. It suggested that the department was interested in making real changes, rather than just disciplining one officer and moving on. What kind of changes is he considering? Bias training, de-escalation techniques, proper procedures for interacting with federal agents, and better supervision of traffic stops in general. He thinks having a federal agent's perspective could help them develop more effective training materials. David thought about this opportunity. It would be a chance to turn his negative experience into something positive that could benefit the entire community. I'd be willing to meet with him, David said, but I want to make sure this isn't just for show. Real change requires ongoing commitment, not just a one-time training session. I think he understands that. The department is facing some serious pressure from the community after word got out about your incident. Several of those neighbors who witnessed the stop have been speaking at city council meetings demanding reforms. This surprised David. He had provided his contact information to the witnesses, but he hadn't expected them to become advocates for police reform. Really? What have they been saying? Hayes smiled. From what I understand, they've been pretty vocal about what they saw. One woman, I think she said she was a retired teacher, gave a speech at last week's city council meeting that got a standing ovation. She described watching you get harassed for nearly an hour and said it was one of the most shameful things she'd ever witnessed in their neighborhood. David felt moved by the fact that these strangers had continued to support accountability, even after the immediate incident was over. Their willingness to get involved demonstrated the power of community engagement in addressing injustice. The teacher's name was Mrs. Johnson, David remembered. She was very kind to me after everything happened. Well, Mrs. Johnson and several other neighbors have apparently formed an informal group to monitor police behavior in their area. They're calling themselves Maple Heights Community Watch, and they're attending police department meetings demanding regular updates on reform efforts. The irony wasn't lost on David that a traffic stop intended to make him feel unwelcome in the neighborhood had actually mobilized the community to demand better policing for everyone. 2 days later, David found himself sitting in Chief Martinez's office discussing the changes that the police department was planning to implement. The chief was a professional-looking woman in her early 50s who had been brought in from another city specifically to reform the department's culture. "Agent Carter, I want to start by personally apologizing for Officer Thompson's conduct. What happened to you was unacceptable, and it reflects poorly on our entire organization." David appreciated the directness of the apology. "Thank you, Chief. I'm more interested in making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else than I am in dwelling on what happened to me. That's exactly why I wanted to meet with you. Your experience has helped us identify some serious problems in our training and supervision procedures. We want to fix those problems, but we need help from someone who understands both law enforcement and what it feels like to be on the receiving end of inappropriate police conduct." Chief Martinez pulled out a thick binder and placed it on her desk. "We've developed a new training curriculum that focuses on implicit bias, constitutional policing, and community relations, but we want to make sure it's effective, not just politically correct." David examined the materials she had prepared. They were comprehensive and seemed to address many of the issues that had led to his problematic encounter with Thompson. "This looks thorough," David said. "But the real test will be implementation. Training is only effective if it's reinforced by supervision and accountability." "Agreed. That's why we're also changing our supervision policies. All traffic stops will now be reviewed monthly by sergeants, and any stop that lacks clear justification will trigger additional training for the officer involved." David was impressed by the scope of the changes being proposed. "What about Officer Thompson specifically? What's going to happen with his case?" Chief Martinez's expression became more serious. "The internal investigation confirmed that Officer Thompson violated several department policies during his interaction with you. He's facing a 30-day suspension without pay, mandatory bias training, and probationary status for the next year. Any additional complaints during that probation period will result in termination." David thought about whether this punishment was appropriate. Part of him felt that Thompson's conduct had been serious enough to warrant termination immediately, but he also recognized that people could learn and change if given the opportunity. "Has Officer Thompson shown any genuine remorse for what happened?" "Actually, yes. He requested a meeting with me last week and admitted that his behavior was inappropriate. He said that seeing the community reaction to the incident made him realize how his actions affected not just you, but the entire relationship between the police and the neighborhood." This surprised David, based on Thompson's behavior during the traffic stop. He hadn't seemed like someone who was capable of self-reflection or genuine change. "Did he ask to meet with me as well?" "He did, but I told him that any such meeting would have to be requested through you directly. I didn't want you to feel pressured into a conversation you weren't ready for." David considered this possibility. Meeting with Thompson could provide closure for both of them, but it could also be awkward and unproductive. "Let me think about that. Right now, I'm more focused on making sure the department's reforms actually happen." Over the following months, David became a regular consultant for the police department's training programs. He participated in role-playing exercises where officers practiced conducting traffic stops professionally and respectfully. He shared his perspective on how law enforcement officers should interact with federal agents, and more importantly, how they should treat all citizens with dignity and respect. The most rewarding part of the process was seeing the engagement from the community. Mrs. Johnson and the other neighbors who had witnessed his traffic stop became regular attendees at the training sessions, providing their perspectives as community members who wanted to support good policing while holding officers accountable for misconduct. During one particularly memorable training session, a young officer asked David how citizens should respond when they believe they're being treated unfairly during a traffic stop. "That's a great question," David replied. "The most important thing is to stay calm and cooperative even if you believe the stop is unjustified. Document everything you can. times, badge numbers, witness information. Don't argue with the officer during the stop, but don't hesitate to file a complaint afterward if you believe your rights were violated. An older officer in the back of the room raised his hand. But what if someone really is acting suspicious? How do we balance community safety with individual rights? David appreciated the sincerity of the question. Suspicious behavior has to be specific and articulable. You can't stop someone just because they're driving through a neighborhood where you think they don't belong. You need to observe actual violations of law or specific behaviors that suggest criminal activity. The training sessions